Scene 1. A narrow, high-vaulted Gothic chamber. A scholar sits brooding at his desk. The scholar speaks. I have, alas, studied philosophy, jurisprudence, medicine too, worst of all theology, with keen endeavor through and through. And here I stand with all my lore, the wretched fool I was before, called Master of Arts, and Doctor to boot. For 10 years almost I confute, and up and down, wherever it goes, I lead my students by the nose, and find that for all our science and art, we can know nothing. It burns my heart. This opening speech comes from one of the monuments of world literature, Johann Wolfgang Goethe's dramatic poem, Faust. The story of an aging scholar who, frustrated with the limitations of human knowledge, enters into a bargain with the devil named Mephistopheles. Faust is one of these epic works of literature. It's frequently spoken of in the same breath with Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, Virgil's Aeneid, Dante's Divine Comedy, Milton's Paradise Lost. Most people have heard of Goethe's Faust. Many people have probably thought, oh yeah, Faust, I should read that one of these days. But very few people actually have read it. Let me just ask for a show of hands in the audience. How many of you have read Faust, either in whole or in part? Okay, we got some love for Goethe's Faust in the audience, approximately a third of the crowd. Yeah, right on, right on. For everyone else, why should you read Faust? Why should you join Goethe on his journey from heaven through the world to hell? That's the question we're going to answer today. Like all great literature, Faust offers grand-scale themes and characterizations. Now, as for the theme of Faust, you could say it's pretty ambitious. The central idea behind Faust is the totality of human experience. What do I mean by that? Faust is a scholar who's learned everything there is to learn. He knows everything there is to know. And he lives in the late German Middle Ages. Apparently at that time it was possible for one person to know everything. But it's not enough for him because he hasn't experienced life. And he wants to get out and see everything, do everything, be everything. That's really what Faust is about. And to understand Goethe's Faust, we have to understand a little bit about the author himself. So, Johann Wolfgang Goethe, as you can see, his dates are 1749 to 1832. In 1773, when Goethe was 24 years old, he wrote his first major play, which made him a celebrity throughout Germany. His first play was called Götz von Berlichingen. A year later, at the age of 25, he wrote his first novel, The Sorrows of Young Werther, which made him a celebrity throughout Europe. Every young man at the time was reading The Sorrows of Young Werther. It was hugely popular. A year after that, now at the age of 26, Goethe is summoned to the town of Weimar by the reigning duke to become his personal advisor and confidant. So just think about this. By the time Goethe is in his mid-20s, he's basically the German Shakespeare. He's his country's leading poet, novelist, playwright. He's also a statesman and an administrator. He's an advisor to the Duke. His various official capacities include inspector of mines, rector at the university. Oh, did I mention that he was also a theater director and manager? In which capacity he served as a mentor to the young Friedrich Schiller? Not too shabby. But on top of that, he was also a scientist who did original work in optics, botany, and biology. Goethe has often been described as the last Renaissance man, the last man who contained within himself all of the knowledge of his time. I stress this point because in order to understand Faust, which is about a scholar who knows everything and who wants to go out into life and do everything, Goethe is writing from personal experience very much here. He knows exactly what he's writing about. So before we actually plunge into the story of Faust, I'd like to outline just a few preliminaries. A first point I want to make is that the story of Faust was not original to Goethe. Indeed, the Faust legend goes back more than 200 years before Goethe's own time. There was a contemporary of Martin Luther, one Johann Georg Faustus. So he lived from about 1480 to 1540, who was reputed to have been a necromancer, a sorcerer, a magician. He was a scholar and a professor, but he was reputed to have consorted with the dark arts. And the story goes that he'd made a pact with the devil, and at the end of his life, the devil came to claim his due and drag the soul of Faustus to eternal damnation. Over the next few hundred years, there were many, many literary adaptations of the Faust story, the most important of which was a play by Christopher Marlowe. Marlowe was an exact contemporary of Shakespeare, very important Elizabethan playwright, and his play is called The Tragical History of Dr. Faustus, which, by the way, is a splendid play in its own right, and I warmly recommend it alongside Goethe's Faust. I think the key thing we need to know about all the earlier versions, including the literary treatments of the Faust legend, is that they portray a man who is an evildoer, who has this hubris. He turns away from God, consorts with the devil, and after a lifetime of pleasure, mindless sensual pleasure of food and drink and women, he's consigned to eternal perdition, and rightly so. The original Faust legend is a cautionary tale. It's a very moralistic, medieval Christian story. And I stress this at the outset because Goethe's Faust couldn't possibly be more different. And I think a lot of this has to do with the fact that Goethe has a much more Enlightenment orientation. He views Faust quite a bit more positively as a man who strives to do good, but who makes a deal with the devil for circumstances which we'll explain presently. Last thing I want to talk about, just as a preliminary point before we plunge into the story of Faust, is to outline Goethe's own labors on his poem. Goethe worked on Faust for no less than 60 years. 60 years. Goethe started writing his Faust when he was in his 20s. So this would have been in the 1770s when Goethe was in his so-called Sturm und Drang phase. Sturm und Drang, which is German for storm and stress. I like to think of the Sturm und Drang as the rebellious adolescent phase of Romanticism. It was a kind of casting off of old, outdated literary conventions, as well as outdated moralities as well, of forging new paths. This was around the time when Goethe wrote The Sorrows of Young Werther. Around that time, he sketched out many of the scenes which would eventually find their way into Faust Part 1, including Faust's early monologues, a little bit of which I quoted at the very beginning, the scenes between Faust and Mephistopheles, which I'll be talking about a lot. That's really crucial for our understanding of where Goethe is going with his poem. And then he left the poem aside. He didn't quite know how to continue. He returned to it sometime in the late 1780s, around 1790. And in 1790, Goethe published a fragment. He published it. It was called Faust, a Fragment, which included roughly the first 2/3 of what is now Part 1. He returned to the story about a decade later, around 1800, and wrote the next major section of the poem, which a lot of it has to do with the tragedy of Gretchen. Gretchen is Faust's first love. She's this sweet, innocent girl who is seduced by Faust, but through various circumstances ends up being abandoned by him. This is one of the most important episodes in the whole first part of the poem. So Goethe filled in some of the gaps, and then what we now know as Part 1 of Faust was published in 1808. And just to give you a kind of an overview of the whole, Part 1 of Faust includes the following sections. The protagonist's first few monologues, where we learn what he's feeling, what he's thinking, the nature of the bargain between him and Mephistopheles, where a lot of the really important characterological and philosophical issues are worked out, and then the whole tragedy of Faust and Gretchen. But Goethe wasn't done yet. he always intended to have a part 2. Now, part 2 is actually twice as long as part 1, and frankly, twice as dense and twice as difficult. And I can only give you the briefest possible sketch of part 2. Basically, Faust goes through a series of ever-widening experiences: politics, science, art, education, warfare, empire building. So he somehow ends up at the court of the Holy Roman Emperor. He becomes involved in politics. He goes back to ancient Greece. Oh yeah, Faust goes back in time to ancient Greece, where he meets various historical and mythological figures. He meets Helen of Troy and has a child with her. How cool is that? Later on, he comes back to his present day Germany, gets involved in a conflict between two rival emperors, and then I'll have a little bit more to say about the final act of part 2 later on. But just from this description, you can gather that part 2 is fairly episodic. It covers a long stretch of time, and we're supposed to assume that Faust and Mephistopheles go on all these many adventures, of which we only get a brief sampling. To put it another way, part 2 is Faust's greatest hits. It's not the whole story, but it gives us some of the highlights of his story. One last point I want to make about Faust Part 1 and 2. When you read Faust for the first time, I recommend focusing on Part 1. Read it slowly, read it carefully, try to get as much out of it as you can. Don't make the mistake that I made 20 some odd years ago of trying to get into part 2 the first time around. It's a little bit much. After you've read part 1, set it aside. Later on, you can come back, reread it, and then go on to part 2. I'm just mentioning that as a kind of a taste of the approach that I'm going to be taking in my upcoming ARU course on the subject. All right, so now let's plunge into the midst of things, and I want to begin before the beginning, because Goethe begins Faust Part 1 with a prologue in heaven. And the prologue in heaven is a conversation between the Lord and Mephistopheles. Those of you familiar with the book of Job in the Old Testament will understand the connection and the resonance here. Basically, Mephistopheles appears before the Lord, and he's complaining how everything on earth is bad and everything with humanity is bad. He even feels pity for mankind because everything is so awful with them. And the Lord says, "Do you know Faust, my loyal servant?" And Mephistopheles says, "I know him well enough. How much do you want to bet," Mephistopheles says to the Lord, "that I can corrupt him, that I can lead him astray, that I can lead him to the dark side?" And the Lord says, "You want to do that? Go ahead, try it. I can't stop you. You have free will. Do whatever you like." But the Lord says something very interesting. He says, "The good man, in his darkling aspiration, remembers the right road throughout his quest." The good man in his darkling aspiration remembers the right road through his quest. Meaning that no matter how man blunders his way, stumbles blindly through life, if he really is a good man, he will ultimately know what path to take. So that basically sets the context for the poem as a whole. At the beginning of Faust Part 1, we meet the aging scholar in his study. I've already quoted a little bit of his first speech. And now let's talk a little bit about the second scene of Part 1. In the second scene of Part 1, Faust is wandering through the city streets. It's Easter Day. There's lots of peasants and other folk wandering around. And Faust is engaged in a conversation with one of his young graduate assistants, a young man by the name of Wagner. They come upon some old peasants who they address themselves to Faust. They say, "Oh, doctor, thank you for coming out and celebrating Easter with us. We remember many, many years ago when you were a young man. Your father was the town doctor, and the two of you helped us, those of us who were suffering from the plague. There was this terrible plague raging through the town, and Faust's father and Faust himself administered medicines and tried to save as many people as they could." Faust is very gracious. He accepts the warm thanks of the peasants, and then he and Wagner move on. The young Wagner says, "Oh, you're such a great man. Everybody admires you. Everybody shows you to their children." And Faust says, "Look, that just makes me feel worse. When the plague was going on, no matter how many people we gave medicine to, we saved one person, 1,000 other people died." This is important because it explains why Faust is so frustrated with the limitations of human knowledge. And during the plague, he would go up to the hill near the town. He would pray. He would fast. Anything to save the town from the plague. None of it availed. And so that's the reason why Faust is so frustrated. He thinks that all human knowledge, all human science and art is good for nothing. And it explains something about the state of Faust's near suicidal despair when we first meet him in the poem. It's at this point that Mephistopheles enters on the scene. Mephistopheles first appears to Faust in the form of a black poodle. Faust brings this poodle home, and of course, the poodle turns into a devil in the shape of a man. And then we get the first few conversations between Faust and Mephistopheles. Here's where we really want to go slowly and understand the dynamics of the relationship between these two characters. The first point to understand is that when Mephistopheles first meets Faust, Faust really is in a state of near suicidal despair. He thinks everything he's learned is useless, everything he's been teaching his students is useless, and he doesn't feel that life has anything to offer him. And so let's just take a brief look at Faust's first speech. I'm going to be quoting at length from some of these speeches just to give you a sense of the beauty of the imagery and the beauty of the poetry. Because frankly, I could stand up here yakking about Faust for hours and hours, but I want to at least give you some of the experience of reading Faust, the beauty of the language and the beauty of the metaphors. So when Mephistopheles appears to Faust, he's wearing this splendid gold and red Spanish attire, as you can see from the painting by Eugène Delacroix. And Mephistopheles says to Faust, look, you want to join me, you want to have a good time, you should be splendidly arrayed just like this. And Faust replies as follows: I shall not cease in all attires to feel the pains of our narrow earthly days. I'm too old to merely play, too young to be without desire. What wonders could the world reveal? You must renounce, you ought to yield. This is the never-ending drone which we must our lifelong hear, which hoarsely all our hours intone and grind into our weary ears. Frightened, I waken to the dismal dawn, wish I had tears to drown the sun, and check the day that soon will scorn my every wish, fulfill not one. If I but think of any pleasure, bright critic day is sure to chide it, and if my heart creates itself a treasure, 1,000 mocking masks deride it. When night descends at last, I shall recline but uneasily upon my bed. The wall is still, no rest is mine, as dreams enmesh my mind in dread. The God that dwells within my heart can stir my depths I cannot hide, rules all my powers with relentless art, but cannot move the world outside. And thus existence is for me a weight, death desirable and life I hate. Now, how do you like that? If I could write just one or two lines of verse as beautiful as that, I would retire to some tropical island. But this scene is crucial for a number of reasons. Now, put yourselves in Faust's position. I think this is important when we're trying to understand great literature. Put yourself in the position of a medieval scholar. He's in his 50s. Everything he's learned he thinks is useless. Everything he's teaching his students is useless. And he doesn't see what to do. He's too old to change, to go on a different track. And he doesn't think that life has anything else to offer him. And this explains to us his state of mind, but it also explains how this scholar, who's basically a good man, a decent man, why he succumbs to Mephistopheles' temptations, why he ultimately agrees to enter into a bargain with him. At this stage, Faust is skeptical. He doesn't think that even the devil can do him any good. He doesn't think that even Mephistopheles can give him any pleasure or any enjoyment. And when Mephistopheles says to him, "Join with me, I'll show you such joys as no man has ever experienced," Faust replies, "What would you, wretched devil, offer? Was ever man's spirit and his noblest strivings grasped by your like, devilish scoffer? But have you foods that are not satisfying? Gold that slips through the fingers like quicksilver, A girl who, nestling in my arms, makes eyes to entice my neighbors. Honor, that perhaps seems best, though like a meteor it turns to vapor. Show me fruits that rot before we pluck them, and trees whose foliage each day makes new. Let's think about this imagery for a moment. What exactly is Faust saying here? Faust is saying he wants foods that don't satisfy. A girl who, while nestling close to him, is already flirting with somebody else. Faust is saying that he wants things that are going to excite his desire without satisfying it. And just a moment later, when Mephistopheles says, okay, well, that's all well and good, but sooner or later, you're going to want to repose and feast on something good. And Faust replies, if ever I recline calmed on a bed of sloth, you may destroy me then and there. If ever flattering you should wile me, that in myself I find delight, if ever with enjoyment you should beguile me, then break on me eternal night. This bet I offer. Now we come to the crux of Goethe's entire vision for Faust Part 1 and Part 2. In the earlier versions of the Faust legend, including Marlowe's play, Faust enters into a very straightforward sort of bargain with Mephistopheles. For 24 years, you will serve me, you will give me whatever I want, food, wine, nice clothing, sex, and then at the end of the conclusion, you can carry me off to hell, do whatever you want with me. The nature of the bargain in Goethe's Faust is totally different. What Faust is saying here is that so his bargain with Mephistopheles will hold so long as Mephistopheles can't give him a single moment of satisfaction, a single moment where he will be tempted to give up further striving. Now we come to the single most crucial line in the entire poem. And please, if you remember nothing else from this talk, remember this one point. The next thing that Faust says to Mephistopheles is, if to the moment I should say, stay a while, thou art so fair. Put me in fetters on that day, I wish to perish then, I swear. Then let the death bell toll, your service done, you shall be free. The clock may stop, the hand may fall, as time comes to an end for me. What's the significance of this one sentence? Stay a while, thou art so fair. Faust is saying that if Mephistopheles can satisfy him, give him one moment of such pure enjoyment, such pure pleasure, that he's tempted to relax, tempted to stop striving, to stop his aspirations, then Faust loses, Mephistopheles wins the bargain and can do whatever he wants with him. And I have to say, no matter how many times I read Goethe's Faust, it never ceases to blow my mind how Goethe thought of this one idea, the nature of this wager, that Mephistopheles will continue to serve Faust until such a time that Faust experiences such a moment of pure happiness that he utters the fateful words, stay a while, thou art so fair. So remember that. That's the key to understanding Faust. Then we get into some of the details of the bargain, and Faust is very clear. He doesn't want pleasure. He doesn't necessarily want to avoid pleasure, but what he really wants is experience. And if you consider the kind of life he's led, he's in his 50s, all his life he's been cloistered in the university, studying, surrounded by musty books. He's never had the experience of going out and enjoying life. That is what Mephistopheles offers him. Mephistopheles is going to make it possible for Faust to become a statesman, a soldier, an artist. In effect, Faust is going to become Alexander, Caesar, Leonardo, Napoleon, all wrapped into one. He's going to experience the totality of human experience. That's the story that we see unfolding over the course of the remainder of Faust Part 1 and later on Faust Part 2. And again, Faust doesn't just want pleasure. He wants all of human experience in all of its, the good, the bad, and the ugly. He wants the summit and the abyss, suffering and bliss. He says, I want to experience all that is the lot of mankind. And that's exactly what he's going to do. Now, at this point, Mephistopheles is understandably skeptical. He thinks, yeah, I'll take this guy to one or two parties, show him a good time, and then he's mine. And probably the reader is a little bit skeptical as well, but no. And the incredible thing about Faust, and why I consider Faust to be one of the most extraordinary characters in literature, one of the most extraordinary egoists in literature, is that he's a man who thinks deeply. He's not an emotionalist. He's not a hedonist. He thinks deeply. He introspects his own motivations. And once he decides something, once he decides that he wants something, or in this case, he decides that he wants everything, he goes after it. And he's not going to stop until he gets all the experience that he wants. The first experience that Faust and Mephistopheles embark on, of course, is Mephistopheles has to take some years off of Faust's age, because Faust is in his 50s and not exactly ideal for an aging scholar in the Middle Ages to go off and experience all the things that wants to experience. So they go to a witch's kitchen. The witch takes 30 years off of Faust's lifespan, so he's now in his 20s. He's handsome and energetic. And so the first adventure is, of course, going to be romance. Faust's first adventure is going to be his first stirring of love. So he's walking down the street. He sees this pretty young thing named Gretchen, and immediately he says to Mephistopheles, "Get me that girl." The story of Gretchen is quite understandably one of the most poignant episodes of the Faust story. It is just an episode because there's so much more that happens later on in part 2, but it is a particularly memorable and poignant episode, and a lot of it has to do with just the genuine innocence and goodness of the character of Gretchen. She's a very, very appealing heroine. Immediately she's taken by this mysterious, handsome, and learned stranger, and as you can imagine, things don't go very well. So Faust does indeed succeed in seducing Gretchen, but all sorts of tragic events happen. Gretchen lives with her mother, and in order for her and Faust to enjoy their night of romance, she has to give her mother a few drops of liquid to put her to sleep. Unfortunately, that's provided by Mephistopheles, and tragically the mother dies as a result of being given this potion. Things get even worse because Gretchen has a younger brother who's a soldier, a young man named Valentin. So Valentin has heard about some of these rumors about this man who's seeing his sister, and the one very brief scene where we meet the soldier brother, he challenges Faust to a duel, and of course, with the aid of Mephistopheles' magic arts, Faust stabs and fatally wounds the brother. So Faust and Mephistopheles have two deaths on their conscience, that of Gretchen's mother and of her brother as well. I wish I had time to go into even more detail of the Gretchen tragedy, but I only say one thing. When you read part 1, Goethe bestows some of his loveliest, some of his most moving lyric poetry on this particular character. And I can only give one example. There's a scene shortly after Gretchen meets Faust for the first time where she's sitting at her spinning wheel. She's thinking of this mysterious, handsome stranger. She already senses that she's drawn to him. And she sings this song. This is the famous Gretchen am Spinnrade, Gretchen at the spinning wheel, where she sings, "My peace is gone, my heart is sore, I shall never find it, ah, nevermore." It sounds so much better in the original, though. "Meine Ruhe ist hin, mein Herz ist schwer, ich finde sie nimmer und nimmermehr." And it's not surprising at all that musicians and composers who've been inspired by the Faust story generally tend to be inspired particularly by the character of Gretchen. So if you want to ask me in the question period about musical settings of Faust, I could go on and on about that for many, many hours. We do learn that Gretchen ends up pregnant. She ends up with child by Faust. But it's at this point that she very briefly drops out of the story, because about 2/3 of the way through part 1, we get a little bit of an interlude, and I have to mention this. This is the famous scene of the Walpurgis night, where Mephistopheles, he wants to show Faust a really good time, so he takes him to this mountaintop somewhere in central and northern Germany, where there's this annual Walpurgis night. It's a witches' Sabbath. It's an annual gathering of witches and wizards and sorcerers and devils and demon. And it's really, really very entertaining the way Goethe describes it and all the really bizarre characters that we meet. At one point, Faust dances with this young witch who, when she's about to speak to him, a little red mouse climbs out of her mouth. The whole scene is full of these bizarre, grotesque little stories. I mean, the Walpurgis Night scene is a really, really wild ride. And I was debating with myself whether to get into this in the talk, but I don't want to give you the impression that Faust is just all this unrelieved Teutonic seriousness. Oh no. Goethe was an entertainer extraordinaire. He could be playful, and he could be very humorous when he wanted to be. So I'll give you just one example. During this Walpurgis Night scene, this witches' Sabbath, we meet all these bizarre characters, these witches and sorcerers and witches, and some of them are actual caricatures, actual lampoons of characters among Goethe's contemporaries, political figures, rationalistic philosophers that Goethe despised, as well as literary critics and rivals. I'll give you just one example. In the Walpurgis Night, we meet this one spirit called the proctophantasmist. The proctophantasmist. What is that all about? It was understood at the time that this character, this proctophantasmist, was intended as a caricature of one Friedrich Nicolai. He was a minor writer, contemporary and rival of Goethe's, who had the temerity, the unmitigated audacity to write a parody of Goethe's first novel, The Sorrows of Young Werther. The parody was called The Joys of Young Werther. You can imagine that Goethe wasn't very happy about this. So he decided, okay, I'm going to mercilessly lampoon this guy in my Walpurgis Night scene. So we meet this, so let me tell you very briefly about Friedrich Nicolai. There's a story about him that he claimed there was a certain castle outside Berlin that was haunted by ghosts. And he claims to have visited this castle and been plagued by these ghosts, but he was able to cure himself by applying leeches to his anus. And now you ask, well, what on earth does this have to do with Faust? Well, so think about the character, the proctophantasmist. What does that mean? Proctophantasmist. It means something like butt ghoster. Right? Because he was plagued by ghosts and he cured himself by applying leeches to his butts. So, butt ghoster. Do you see where I'm going with this? There's something strange in the neighborhood. Who are you going to call? Butt ghoster. I think we need to work on the audience participation a little bit. But there you see. Okay, so consider that a kind of a parenthetical insertion within our broader story. But I just want to give you the sense that Goethe really could be a lot of fun when he wanted to. Returning back to the Gretchen story, Faust learns that Gretchen is in a dungeon. She's committed infanticide, and at this point, she's basically lost her reason with the death of her mother, the death of her brother, being ostracized by her community for being pregnant. She's in a kind of like Ophelia in Hamlet. She's in a state of distraction, doesn't quite know where she is. So she's in a dungeon awaiting execution. Faust is determined to save her. He says to Mephistopheles, let's go to the dungeon. We have to rescue Gretchen. So that's what they do. And in the just few remaining moments of sanity left to her, she recognizes Faust. He wants to save her, take her out of the dungeon. She refuses. She refuses to go with him. She refuses to be rescued. She decides that she wants to accept responsibility for what she's done, for the deaths of her mother and her brother and her infant baby. Mephistopheles shows up, and this is just before the curtain goes down at the end of part 1. Mephistopheles says to Faust, we have to get out of here. She's condemned. There's nothing you can do for her. At that moment, we hear a voice from above. She is saved. So Gretchen is, even though she is executed, because she remains in the dungeon, she accepts responsibility for her action. She's not condemned to eternal perdition. End of curtain, end of part 1. Let me now very, very briefly just summarize some of the main points of part 2, and then I'll focus particularly on the ending of part 2, which is, I think, crucial for our understanding of the poem as a whole. I mentioned that part 2 is fairly episodic. We go through all these different adventures of Faust and Mephistopheles. There's the scene at the court of the Holy Roman Emperor where Faust performs all sorts of magic tricks, and where Mephistopheles creates paper money. Rather appropriate, I think. Then I mentioned that in part 2, Faust and Mephistopheles go back in time to ancient Greece, where they meet various mythological and historical characters, including, I think the philosophers in the audience will love this, Thales and Anaxagoras. And we come upon a sort of a debate between the two early pre-Platonic philosophers. That whole conversation is a lot of fun. Then, of course, there's the whole episode of Helen of Troy, who represents the ideal of feminine beauty. Faust succeeds in making Helen his lover, and they even have a child, a young lad named Euphorion. Then in Act 4, Faust returns to present-day Germany. He becomes involved in this conflict, this warfare between two rival emperors, and that finally brings us to Act 5, the fifth and final act of Part 2. And here I want to pause for a little bit and discuss this scene in a little more detail, because this is where we really get the resolution of the bargain, the pact between Faust and Mephistopheles. Faust has formulated this idea, this very ambitious engineering project. He's decided that he's going to try to reclaim land from the sea. How is he going to do this? He's going to build dikes and trenches and dams. He's going to drain away the sea, drain away all this swampland, and he's going to build all this new land, all this habitable, fertile land for human beings, and create this kind of paradise. And he's very excited by this idea, and he's not doing it for fame. He's not doing it for fortune. He's not, as Mephistopheles suggests, he's not doing it so that bards will sing songs about him in eons to come. No, he's doing it because it's a creative task in which he will be able to reshape nature and leave behind something permanent so that even when he's gone, the traces of his labors and of his existence on the earth will survive him, will remain after him. That, I think, is very crucial to Faust. Let's skip ahead now to almost the end of Part 2. We now meet Faust, and presumably he's been at this task for many, many decades. He's been building dikes and dams and trenches and creating all this fertile land. He's now a very old man. He's over 100 years old, which I guess means he's over 130 years old if you count the earlier when he had 30 years subtracted from his life. So he's 130 years old. He's blind, but he's still as formidable as ever and still as strong-willed as ever. So he's overseeing all of these labors on his land reclamation project, and he has a vision of this glorious future that he's created where there are going to be these vast tracts of land with people living side by side. And he says it's going to be a paradise, but Faust's idea of paradise is unique. His idea of a paradise doesn't mean these people are going to be sitting around and doing nothing and just munching fruit and enjoying themselves. No, these people are going to have to continue building dikes and dams and trenches, and the water is always going to be in danger of coming from the sea. So, in other words, Faust is imagining this race of millions and millions of Faust-like beings, these beings like himself, who are going to be toiling and striving and creating an even greater future. And as he has this vision of the future that he's creating, he discovers what he takes to be the meaning of life. What he's been searching for all along on this whole journey, what he didn't understand at the beginning of his journey, now he starts to understand. And in the final words that he says as follows: "This is the highest wisdom I own, the best that mankind ever knew. Freedom and life are earned by those alone who conquer them each day anew. Beset by such danger, each one thrives. Childhood, manhood, old age lead active lives. At such a throng I would gladly stare. Free men on free ground their freedom share. Then to the moment I could say, stay a while. Thou art so fair. The traces of my earthly days no eons can impair. As I presage so high a happiness, I now enjoy the highest moment." At that moment, Faust drops dead. Right when he experiences the conclusion of his journey, the highest moment, the one moment where he imagines in the future that he's achieved this goal and he wants to say to the passing moment, "Stay a while, thou art so fair." So has Faust lost his bargain? Well, insofar as he loses his life, yes. Does that mean that Mephistopheles has won the bargain? Well, I'm not going to answer that question today. You'll have to read the poem to find out. But I will say this. From what I've said so far about how Goethe took the original medieval Christian legend of Faust and turned it upside down, turned it from a kind of a cautionary tale of avoid hubris, be humble, be obedient. He's completely turned that upside down. I think you can get some sense of where Goethe is going to take the story later on. And I'll just add to this, Goethe, and he himself understood this, Goethe had a fundamentally non-tragic view of existence. No, I would go even farther than that. I would say that of all the great romantics, and I'm not talking now about the young Firebrand, the young Sturm und Drang Firebrand who wrote The Sorrows of Young Werther, the mature Goethe, the Goethe who wrote Faust Part 1 and Faust Part 2, I think in many ways he was the most benevolent of all the great romantic writers. I think that's something that comes through very clearly in the final scenes of Faust. Perhaps a good way to conclude would be with a quotation from one of Goethe's greatest admirers, Friedrich Nietzsche, who, and I particularly like this quote because not only does it summarize perfectly Goethe's own nature, but it tells us something about Faust himself. In The Twilight of the Idols, Nietzsche says the following, quote, "He did not retire from life, but put himself into the midst of it. He was not faint-hearted, but took as much as possible upon himself, over himself, into himself. What he wanted was totality. He fought the mutual extraneousness of reason, sense, feeling, and will, preached with such abhorrent scholasticism by Kant, Goethe's antipode. He disciplined himself to wholeness. He created himself." Unquote. Ladies and gentlemen, I think the essence of Faust is that it's the story of a man who disciplines himself to wholeness. And through perfecting his own spirit, and through expressing it through practical action, toiling and striving, succeeds in creating himself. In the words of a more recent Goethe scholar, I would say, reading Faust is good for your soul. So give your souls a few weeks off, take a break from all your ceaseless striving, and join Goethe on his journey from heaven through the world to hell, and be prepared for a transformative experience. You've been such an awesome audience. I only wish I could prolong the moment. Thank you.
Thank you so much for bringing that poem alive. When I first read it, I was in a university course that misintegrated it completely. I won't go into details, but we were taught about a theme of the divine feminine within that poem. Could you speak to that a little bit? I want to hear what your thoughts are.
So the question was about the Goethe's idea of the eternal feminine. So the very last lines of the poem, which doesn't really give too much away, das ewig Weibliche zieht uns hinan. The eternal feminine leads us heavenward. It relates to something that occurs at the very end of Faust. Okay, unfortunately, this is going to give away this is a bit of a spoiler. This is going to give away something about the very end, but I think it's a very good question. At the very end of the poem, Mephistopheles doesn't actually succeed in getting Faust's soul. And at the very end, we see Faust's soul gradually being borne aloft by various angels and blessed boys and other figures. And waiting for him at the top is Gretchen. Gretchen is now in heaven, and she's actually pleading on Faust's behalf. She's, because he's the lover who strayed, and she's taking sympathy on him, and she goes before the Virgin Mother. Goethe uses the term the Mater Gloriosa, the glorious mother, the Virgin Mary. Gretchen pleads to the Blessed Virgin on behalf of her lover, whom she still, of course, loves, to grant him forgiveness. I think there's one particularly beautiful line towards the end of part 2, which is this line that's sung by the angels. He who strives with all his might, him we can redeem. He who strives with all his might, him we can redeem. I think that's really the essence of what Faust is about. And this idea of the eternal feminine, it's a controversial idea. It's an idea that's been endlessly debated by Faust scholars. I don't have one single perfect interpretation that I can offer, but I think one element of this is this idea of divine grace, which Faust receives through Gretchen, who is pleading on his behalf in heaven. So I hope that helps a little bit. There's much more we can say about it, but that's gives you some idea of.
Thank you so much.
I love the talk, but I also noticed that Goethe died in 1832, the same year Faust Part 2 was published. What was the timeline of that? Was there any connection between the two events, or was it just a coincidence?
Goethe worked on Faust Part 2 in the last half a dozen or so years of his life. He finished it in 1831, tied it up very nicely with a bow and ribbon, and set it aside with instructions that it should be published after his death. Why would he do that? Presumably Goethe suspected all the various questions and controversies and conundrums and confusions that would arise from Part 2. And Part 2, understandably, it is dense, it is challenging in many ways. He didn't want to have to deal with that. So he said, publish it when I'm gone. So Goethe died at the beginning of 1832, and Faust Part 2 was published some months later, published posthumously.
Thank you.
I had the exact experience that Nikos described in his introductory remarks. I have really no interest in literature. I don't know why I came here. And that was totally captivating. You're a great salesman for literature.
Thank you, Matt.
What I found myself wondering about when you were describing the opening parts of Part 1, and I guess this is just a plot question, but I'm really curious about it. In the opening of the story, he's extremely cynical and totally resigned that it sounds like all human effort ultimately leads to nothing. That's how I understood your characterization. And then he enters into this deal where he is reaching for the totality of existence. And it seems he has to undergo some sort of change that makes him want to live. Move from the suicidal state to the wanting to live and wanting to live so much that he experiences everything. How does that happen?
Well, the first thing the real question here is, what does Mephistopheles give Faust? Well, the first thing he gives him is youth. That's actually a theme that runs through much of Faust. Actually, even before the prologue in heaven, there is a brief scene preceding that, which is called the Prelude in the Theater, where there's a conversation between a director, a serious poet, and a comic player, and they're basically talking about how they're going to put on this play of Faust. And the poet, who's clearly an older writer, at the very end he says, he wants something that's going to make him feel young again, that's going to make him feel, give me my youth again, he says repeatedly. I think that's an idea that was very much at the forefront of Goethe's mind as he was writing Faust. So the idea of being rejuvenated, being given a second chance at life. And also, because Mephistopheles is a devil, he has magic powers, he does make it possible for Faust to go to the Walpurgisnacht, that witch's Sabbath that I mentioned. He makes it possible for Faust to go to the court of the Roman emperor and perform all sorts of conjuration tricks, conjuring up the shades of Helen and Paris, of Troy. So it's what Mephistopheles makes possible. The fact that he makes it possible for Faust to have all of these experiences, which he, as a cloistered medieval scholar, would have absolutely no chance of experiencing.
Got it. Thank you.
Hello. So it's obviously one of the great poems that has inspired lots of other pieces of literature and art, and I wondered if you could outline any of your favorites that are sort of secondary works.
Other favorite literary works besides
No,
Faust?
pieces that have been inspired by Goethe's Faust.
Literary work. Oh, musical pieces? inspired-
Musical, theatre, whatever.
Oh, okay. So musical works inspired by Faust. Got to start with Franz Schubert. Franz Schubert wrote quite a few songs, mostly inspired by some of the poems, some of the songs that Gretchen has in Part 1. And Goethe actually indicates that some of these lyrics sung by Gretchen are meant to be, they're meant to be songs. They're meant to be accompanied by music. So I mentioned Gretchen at the spinning wheel, my peace is gone, my heart is sore, I shall never find peace, nevermore. That's one of Schubert's most famous and most beautiful songs. The original German is Gretchen am Spinnrad, but if you search on YouTube, Gretchen at the spinning wheel, you'll find that song. There's also a scene where Gretchen is praying before an image of the Mater Dolorosa, the sorrowful mother, where she's pregnant, she's been abandoned by her lover, and she's praying for mercy. That was also set by Schubert. But I also want to mention some big works. So here are a couple of my favorites. Robert Schumann, one of the great German composers of his age, wrote this very large-scale work for solo voices, chorus, and orchestra called Scenes from Goethe's Faust. Robert Schumann, Scenes from Goethe's Faust. It includes a couple of scenes from Part 1, but it also includes some scenes from Part 2, including the whole concluding scene of Faust's transfiguration, the ascent of Faust's soul through heaven. I have to say, and this is huge praise, after I got to know Schumann's Scenes from Faust, I really felt like I understood Faust better. And there aren't too many musical works that you can say that about. Schumann had an incredible, of all the great composers, Schumann had an incredible literary sensibility, an incredible literary insight. And his music really makes you feel what the poem wants you to feel and experience what the poem wants you to experience. So I can't recommend too highly Robert Schumann's Scenes from Faust. Franz Liszt wrote a wonderful Faust symphony. I think it's Liszt's masterpiece. I think it's one of his greatest works. It's in 3 movements. The first movement is Faust. It's a portrait of Faust as a character. Each of the themes represents different aspects of Faust's nature. Faust the scholar, Faust the doubter, Faust the lover, Faust the striver, etc. Then the second movement, which is a contrast, is the portrait of Gretchen. Her innocence, her goodness, her naivete. Then the third movement is Mephistopheles, and I can't get over how brilliant this is. Mephistopheles doesn't have any themes of his own. What Liszt does is he takes the Faust themes from the first movement and twists them, tortures them, distorts them, makes them really ugly and grotesque, and that's Mephistopheles. Because Mephistopheles doesn't create anything. He's a destroyer, not a creator. And so he doesn't have any music of his own. He just takes Faust's themes and corrupts them in really quite brilliant and striking ways. One last thing I want to mention, which I think no musical survey of Faust can ignore, Gustav Mahler's Symphony No. 8, it's in 2 huge parts. The first part is a setting of a medieval Latin hymn, the Veni Creator Spiritus, Come Creator Spirit. But the second huge part of Mahler's 8th Symphony is a complete setting of the last scene from Faust Part 2, which is the scene of the transfiguration, the ascent of Faust's spirit to heaven. So it's a tremendous work, I think unmissable and unforgettable. Those are just a few starting points for those who want to explore that further.
Thank you for a great talk and for bringing the poem so vividly to life. I wondered if you could talk at all about the reception of Faust, especially Part 2, which I think is quite unusual. I don't know how it would have been viewed at the time of publication. And also, if it was translated, how soon it was translated, and what the rest of Europe made of this extraordinary work.
Okay, so the reception of Part 1, I think right away, right after Part 1 was published in 1808, Faust became the iconic German literary work. It was, there were the settings by Beethoven and Schubert and other composers. It became hugely popular. Part 2 has always been more problematic. People sometimes ask me, is Faust ever staged? Is it ever actually performed on stage in front of an audience? Part 1, yes, quite frequently. Part 2, very seldom, just because it's so long. If you were to stage Part 2 in its entirety, it would be I don't know, as long as Wagner's Ring of the Nibelung. It would be 12, 13, 14. Now, it's very, very long, very, very complicated. And because the imagery and the poetry is so dense, the whole scene where Faust goes back to ancient Greece, Goethe is trying in German to imitate the Greek hexameters and different poetic meters. It's a poetic tour de force, but it takes a long time to get into and to understand what he's really trying to do. So Part 2 has always been a little bit more difficult for people to read and assimilate than Part 1. Translations. One of the first really great translations of Faust was the French translation by Gérard de Nerval. Gérard de Nerval, which was, I think that was done sometime that was originally Part 1, and which served as the basis for the French operatic settings by Hector Berlioz, one of the great French romantic composers, and the very famous French opera by Charles Gounod, which many of you probably know or have heard some excerpts from that. As far as English translations are concerned, there were many, many English translations in the 19th century. The first two really significant early English translations came from about the middle or the the 1850s, 60s, and 70s were Anna Swanwick and Bayard Taylor. And those two translations are considered as having withstood the test of time. They're available on Gutenberg and the Internet Archive. They're still considered pretty good. And they were not the first. There were dozens and dozens of English translations before then. But those are the first two which have really withstood the test of time. While we're on the subject of translation, I want to mention my personal favorite, Walter Kaufmann. Walter Kaufmann was a German-American philosopher. He translated many of the works of Nietzsche. Some of you have probably read his Nietzsche translations. Wonderful. He was a great poet, great translator. Now, the interesting thing about and by the way, his Faust is the one that I'm going to be using in the course, the ARU course next year. His translation of Faust is beautiful, poetically beautiful. Most of the lines that I recited for you today were from the Kaufmann translation, with a few of my own little changes and modifications. The interesting thing about Kaufmann is his translation is somewhat abridged. He gives all of Part 1, but just selections of Part 2. And I actually think if you're reading Faust for the first time, Kaufmann's translation is the one to go for, because he gives you the most important sections of Part 2, including the very end that I talked about, Faust's concluding monologue, and then the final scene of Faust's transfiguration. And then after you've read Kaufmann's translation, then if you want to, you can progress to a longer translation that gives all of Part 2. But Kaufmann is definitely, for poetic quality, insight into Goethe's ideas, and giving all of Part 1 and the most crucial scenes of Part 2, Kaufmann is definitely the one to go for. So thanks for all your excellent questions, and thank you for joining me.